Hello, and welcome to the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. My name's Lilly Ryan. I'm one of your regular hosts, and I am speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia. In today's conversation, I'm joined by Ryan Collingwood and Andrew Jones. Ryan is a data strategist at Thoughtworks and is currently writing a book on data contracts that will be out in, 2025, Ryan?
Yeah, Q1 2025. Fingers crossed.
Wonderful. And Andrew is the author of Driving Quality with Data Contracts, which was published in 2023. Andrew, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Andrew. I'm a independent data consultant and I help organisations build data platforms that reduce risk and drive revenue. I've been doing that for a little while now, which is why I ended up coming up with data contracts a few years ago and writing that book that you mentioned.
That's wonderful. And as you may have guessed, we are here today to talk about data contracts. This is a topic that has been kicking around for quite some time and has recently, I think, come through quite strongly in the way that we're all focusing on data and a lot of our practices. So to talk about it today and to get to terms with what data contracts are, where they fit into the software delivery lifecycle and all of that kind of stuff, Ryan and Andrew are going to be our expert guides. And to kick us off, what is a data contract?
Yeah, sure. I think the easiest way to think about it, particularly if you're not familiar with data engineering and sort of a data landscape, the easiest way to think about it is it's an API for data. So the reason why I come up with the idea originally was we were getting data directly from our databases, chucking them into a data warehouse, and we're trying to use that to drive data applications. And as you know, if you know about APIs, like you generally don't go direct to a database because that database keeps changing. The schemas keep changing, the database is evolving all the time, and you don't want that to affect your downstream applications. And that's the kind of situation we were in. We want to use our data for more important things, use it for more revenue-generating applications, use it for more sort of AI and ML-based applications, and we couldn't do that because our data was not reliable enough. So I started thinking about why that was the case. And eventually I realised that the problem was the lack of interfaces. The fact was building on top of a database meant that we couldn't have reliable data streams from the upstream applications. And because I've got a software engineering background, I started thinking about why that was the case. And eventually I came to the idea that we need some sort of API here, we need some sort of interface here. That's what was missing. That's what was preventing us from building reliable applications on top of our data. So yeah, I like to think of it as an API for data. And the key word there really is interface. It's an interface to data that provides abstraction, provides a place for us to ensure that the transfer of data between one place and another is reliable, more reliable than it was before.
How does this differ from straight up API documentation?
Yeah, it's similar in a way. The difference really is the interface that you provide data through. So in API, generally, you're making a call back and forth, you're getting small amounts of data moving around, or you're making a call to start an action. With data, you generally need to have an entire data set. For example, if you want to train a data science model, so that might be in a table in a data warehouse somewhere, rather than a sort of HTTP API. Or it might be in a streaming application like Kafka or similar. You could use data contracts there. But generally, you move around greater volumes of data, and the interaction between the consumer and provider of that interface is a bit different than it is compared to a standard HTTP or REST-based API.
Kind of coming back to this topic of interfaces, it's interesting, Andrew, you were speaking about one of the fundamental differences with data, right, compared to say API specifications that we tend to think of them for web services, is that the interface, you mentioned a couple there like Kafka or, even your flavor of SQL, like that can change. And, that's an implementation detail that, is fundamental and, as much as people might want to sort of have like an omni connector for every single type of database interface in the world. And there are some things that kind of take some of that pain away. There still is going to be some difference here and there. But coming back to the value, one of the values that I see around the data contract, again, that word interface, is that in my mind, what I really saw in data contracts was this interface, as in it is a plane of glass where both systems and people can look at the data, understand what the data is, and when I say data, it's data plus context, so information about the data. And it's having that sort of standardized and not having to think about how we're going to describe the interface, because we figure that out ahead of time and then we apply that pattern. As time goes by, I don't know whether it's just because I'm getting lazier or getting older, but I see a real value in not having to think about how I'm going to do the thing while doing the thing. If I can just do the thing, that makes me happy. So yeah, that's a great call out there around how, yes, we can think of it as an API for data, but fundamentally the nature of the problem does mean that there's going to be a little bit of differences here and there. And so having something that's kind of consistent that we can hold on to and also gives us guidance around the things that we should be describing as part of that information about our data is only going to be a good thing.
So yeah, exactly that, Ryan. And when we talk about interfaces, we started off talking about the technical side. So it could be a Kafka, it could be a database. But when you start describing the interface, like I say, you don't want to describe exactly how it's done. You want to describe what you want to achieve from that. So you start describing, I want to make data available to my consumers through, say, a streaming application. And then you also want to, because it's data, there's more things you need to describe with data. So maybe you want to describe how timely it is. Is it going to be hourly? Is it going to be daily? Is it going to be real time? You might also want to describe what kind of data is in there. Is it personal data? Is it not personal data? How can this data be used? What can it be joined with? What does it actually mean in business context? So once you start thinking about, and this kind of journey we went on, we started thinking of, we need an interface. But once you start describing data in enough detail to create this interface, you can then start putting all sorts of things about data contract to help describe data even more. So like I said, turning that data plus the metadata plus context into information that can be consumed much more quickly and much more easily by the data consumers, so they can build the data applications much more quickly, as well as be much more reliably and deliver greater value to the organisation, which I think is particularly important as we're trying to do more with data, particularly with things like ML and AI these days. But whatever it is trying to do with data, being able to do it quicker and cheaper is a great thing for the organisation.
Yeah.
To give our listeners a sense of what you're talking about when it comes to the way that these things are defined, we have talked about the kinds of schemas that you might want. What does it actually look like in practice for someone to define? There is, for example, the Open Data Contract Standard, which is a standard, but we know that there could be other standards, and organizations may want to define their own depending on their use cases. How do you actually, from a nuts and bolts perspective, put a data contract together? What does it look like?
Yeah, it's there's a standard, the Open Data Contract Standard, which I'm a little bit involved in as part of the steering committee there. And that's quite good because it's kind of a YAML-based standard that contains everything you could think about putting in a data contract. But I wouldn't necessarily say that people should use that just off the bat necessarily, because when you think about how to define data contracts in your organisation, every organisation is a bit different, but more importantly, people who's going to be completing that data contract, like using that data contract, the interface needs to be, the implementation of data contracts needs to work for them. So, I'll give you an example where I worked previously. We defined data contracts in this kind of random language that many people might not have heard of called JSONet. And it's like JSON with extensions. It's like a configuration language that came out of Google. And it's not because it's the best way to implement data contracts. It's because our engineering teams, who we wanted to create these data contracts and manage these data contracts and own these data contracts, these engineering teams, they use JSON to define the APIs. They use JSON to define the infrastructure as code. So it made sense for us to define data contracts in the same way, because we wanted it to be clear that data contracts were at this sort of level. They're similar to APIs, similar to your infrastructure as code. They're as important as these things. And to reduce the friction for adoption, we want it to be as easy as possible for us software engineers to use. So that's why we use JSONet. I wouldn't recommend anyone using JSONet unless they're already using it. But the key point there is, when you think about implementing data contracts in your organisation, think about, first of all, what you want to put in it, which might be quite similar compared to other organisations. So you can use the standard for inspiration there. Things like ownership, things like SLOs, things like schemas, they're going to be quite standard across organisations. But when it comes to implementing it in your organisation, think about how you want for data contract owners to own those data contracts, how they're going to be using it, and start from there rather than making them use, say, JSONet or Avro or Protobuf or whatever it is you might want to use. Think about the user first.
Yeah, like definitely resonate with that. My contacts when I first encountered data contracts, the number of people that had serious technical chops were definitely in the minority. And, I'll just say it, my first attempt at a data contract was essentially an Excel spreadsheet, because that is what the people that I needed to get knowledge out of, that's what they understood. That's what they were comfortable with. And, and yeah, it's not necessarily my favorite way to structure data, but it is a start. And it was good enough for me to kind of get going. And then gradually over time, I managed to find something that worked a little bit better for me, but was still within their tolerance that they could work with, that we could then collaborate on and work together. But yeah, I definitely agree. Identify your audience, so so perhaps there's also maybe a moment to kind of talk about the general parties involved, the data producers and the data consumers. You may find yourself in the situation where I was initially, where I was both the consumer and effectively the producer, working in a centralized data team, which is perhaps a topic we can briefly chat about in a second. But you sort of recognize who your parties are, what their level of comfort is. And then, I think it's great in your situation, Andrew, where you had an existing set of tooling that worked for people, they were comfortable with it. Because, when we're changing the way people work, I do believe that people have like a tolerance for sort of the amount of stuff that you can throw at them at once before they start getting uncomfortable, and it varies by people. And so if by reusing things that people are already comfortable with, that, gives you a little bit more wiggle room to kind of make people uncomfortable, then, that's a smart move.
You're talking a lot about making sure that you meet people where they're at within the organization, and ensuring that whatever your data contracts are things that people can actively use and understand and be part of creating. What kind of maturity does an organization need to have as a prerequisite for getting value out of data contracts or making them work in the first place? In one case, to me, maybe it would imply the existence of databases, but we also know that many organizations have to start with spreadsheets, and that's really, it makes a lot of sense. The world runs on Excel in a lot of cases, and that's something that we have to work with. So what kind of situation does an organization need to get benefit from a data contract and make it work for them?
It's not one size fits all, but certainly the problem that led me to encountering data contracts was I was at a point in an organization where, after much inspection of the data platforms, the data systems, which I had inherited, and there was still this perception of there being a data problem. And there were some things that needed some uplift, but really what it came down to in the end was, as career limiting as it may sound, often data is a side effect of things happening. Right. And if those things that are happening are not happening in a consistent manner, so if there's 3 different ways to process a refund, that means that there could be at least 3 different expressions of the data associated to that event, process a refund, you're going to have data quality challenges, right? And so we got to the stage at this organization where it's like, all right, let's have a conversation about what our processes are. Let's standardize some things. There'd been rapid growth. People had to kind of adapt an event as they went. And sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes you just got to make it up. You got to figure it out. You got to get things done. But then certainly I think technologists are familiar with the idea of technical debt. At some point, you have to pay down the debt that you've accumulated. And just like technical debt, there's process debt. And so that's what initially led me to this thing of, all right, well, we're having this conversation about what are our processes. Here is an opportunity to codify all of this great information and this agreement that we're getting into some sort of thing that can be reused. And as a recovering business analyst, in my past lives, I had exposure to things like data dictionaries and what have you. And I think kind of also having some software development exposure, I thought, well, if we do this right, if we do this in a way that is structured and parsable, we can use this. This can be a living document. This doesn't have to be a document that's correct at the launch of this thing and then immediately becomes out of date once we hit our first Sev 1, and then we do like an in-place fix. And then, the documentation and the implementation just diverge, right? If the documentation can be part of the integration, can be part of the solution, that as it evolves and as it lives, well, wow, that's a document that's worth something. So to come back to the question of, where should you be as an organization? I think that if you are at a point of, having data quality challenges and I think if you are considering data quality challenges, it's also worth having a conversation around, well, are our processes actually what we need them to be? Because you can tackle the data quality on its own, but I feel that having that conversation around, is the activity that generates this data what we expect it to be? Are we agreed, right? You're just kicking the ball down the road. Yeah. So that will kind of be the big call out there, is that if you are serious about this, I would say that, are you willing to have a conversation about what it is that we do that generates this data? And are we agreed? Are we aligned on what those processes are? Because we've briefly touched on it, but within the parlance of data contracts, and I really love the way that, Andrew, you framed this in your book, the conversation around that there are data producers and data consumers. So data producers are people that are producing data. It says that they're in the name, and consumers obviously want to consume it. But the real kind of big gotcha is often data producers don't know or don't recognize, or if you want to be nihilistic, don't care. But I'd say that's the minority of cases. I think it's more they don't know, they don't recognize that they're producing data. Because if you're dealing with a department of your company that's in procurement and you ask them, what's your role? What's your function? They're not going to say it's to enter purchase orders, right? They're going to say something like, it's to source materials at a great price so that we can, have a better margin. It might be something like that, right? But they're not going to say that it's something related to data entry. But capturing that data, things like capturing purchase orders, it's vitally important for like the rest of the business, because it's all these series of interconnected value chains, right? Because that information about the purchase orders makes doing things like reconciling the finances possible. And if it's not done or it's poorly done, it makes this other really important task really difficult. So that's why I say, where does an organization need to be? I think it needs to be kind of at that point of a reckoning around, yes, maybe it's born out of a concern around data quality, but I think to really make a difference, there must be an openness to have a conversation about what is our process. And I think underlying it, this is where it kind of touches into like the social aspect of it, is being prepared to develop empathy for, describing that scenario of data producer, way upstream and data consumer way downstream, right? Is that I do believe that if we help those people who are upstream have empathy for the people who are downstream from them, to go like, this information that is perhaps kind of a chore for you to fill in and capture and do has a real material difference to these people downstream.
I want to come back to that issue around empathy in a minute, Ryan, because I think it's something that's really worth digging into. Andrew, from your point of view and in your experience, what has it been like working with a variety of different contexts to make data contracts work? And what have you learned about it over the time where you've been maturing these ideas for yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, like Ryan said, many organizations struggle with data quality, so that's kind of where they come from. But the ones that are looking most at data contracts to try and help them change the organization are ones where they are now using data for something more important than, well, even more important than it was before. So it's some part of their strategic goal, whether that's ML and AI based, or that's just using data to create products to drive revenue or differentiate themselves in the market. It's kind of that realization that data is key to a business that gives those organizations the, I don't want to say the freedom, but the ability, the chance to look again at how they're doing data and really like do a root cause analysis on like, why can we not achieve this now? What is the problem we're trying to solve here to achieve our goal? And then you go back to data quality issues, or you go back to how you're sourcing the data and whether there's any interface around that, and eventually you come back to data contracts. So there's organizations that have this strategic goal, which requires better data, and they go from there back up the stream to work out why the data isn't what it needs to be.
How do you get to that point in a conversation where you help people to the realization that it is a data quality issue? Because as far as I can see, and in a lot of my experience, it has certainly been the case that data quality issues are the root of many different types of business problems. But because they are so deeply interconnected, as Ryan said, these are byproducts of other actions that create the data. And because data is so deeply interconnected with everything a business does, it can be really hard to identify that as a particular issue. And when you do, it's also kind of difficult to get buy-in from people who are not data engineers or data scientists to participate in a conversation like this and see it as something that is worth investing their time in and worth investing their time in evolving and maintaining over a longer period. So in your experience, Andrew, how do you get to a point with a business like that where you really need to come to that realization collectively in order for a data contract to work?
Yeah, it's really all about communication. The problem data teams often have is they're in a part of business, maybe under IT or even under finance, but they're not generally they're generally kind of hidden in business, and they have been almost suffering in silence with this. They are expected to get data from a variety of sources at a variety of quality levels and turn that into reporting. And I think that's kind of okay if the results weren't that important. I mean, they can't be important. Reporting is important, particularly if they start doing revenue reporting and things like that. They are important to business, but they're not critical to business. If it fails, the business carries on running. Now they're starting to do more important things. They need to, or they have the ability to start having these conversations with those producing data and really highlight the issues they're having on like, why are they not able to turn this data around quickly? Why does their pipelines keep failing? And if they keep failing, then how can we build this, whatever strategic goal they want to build on top of that data? So when people start asking questions like that, they need to have the ability, or they need to feel confident enough to raise issues and say, well, this is the reason. It's because the data stream keeps changing, or the data entry is not correct, or whatever it might be. They need to have these conversations. And that's what really we spent a lot of time doing. Like I started off talking about data contracts in a technical sense, but really in my experience, a lot of it's about communication. And when I started doing data contracts, I had a great product manager I worked with, and between us, we spent so much time talking to all parts of our business, whether that's software engineers, whether that's the CTO, whether that's people in between. Doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter who, but like always talking, always communicating the challenges we're having, really repeating that message in different ways, different audiences, explaining why we had to change things in one part of business to achieve things in our part of business, in data part of business. So really it's all about communication.
Ryan, I've seen you in the past when we've discussed this topic say that data contracts are a document for both humans and machines. And that is something that I would love to hear a bit more about from you, particularly as it relates to the way that we can evolve data contracts now that they are becoming a bit more of a mainstream topic that people really want to engage with.
Yeah. As I mentioned previously, I see this, a data contract is bundling. Yes, this is about data, but this is really information about data, so metadata. It's a word that kind of has been used so often that it feels like it's losing its meaning. But really, this is kind of what I see a lot of the value about the data contract is like, this is a document that describes what the data is. And what I mean by that is the meaning of the data. So one of my bugbears that I've had around the discourse, particularly amongst data engineering folks, and God bless them, I love them, they're my tribe, but we tend to get really fixated on schema, and that's often where the conversation ends. And anyone else outside of like the data engineering world does not particularly care about schema. They don't understand schema. They'd be far more interested in the semantics. What does this data mean? And how can I use it? And how am I allowed to use it? And what were the conditions under which this information was captured? Because if you think of, say, a table of email addresses, let's just say, and you have no other context about why this table of email addresses exists. I mean, for one thing, PII spidey senses tingling. But, let's overlook that for a second, right? If you just know that it is a table that has string or varchar type data that looks like email addresses, that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. But if you then learn, oh, hold on, these email addresses represent people that have told us, please stop emailing me, right? That's a very different conversation, because if you didn't know that, and perhaps you were misbehaving, you might take that list of email addresses and go like, oh, fantastic. These must belong to customers. They want to hear from us. Let me send them some good news about the fantastic things we're doing. But this data set represents people that do not want to hear from you, right? And this is the kind of information that is often, as I say, it's not bundled with the data. So this is another important element about data contracts, is that data contracts allow us to speak for the data in ways the data can't necessarily speak for itself. And so that's a really important aspect about how data contracts are both for the benefit of machines and also for the benefit of humans. Because where, the benefit of the machines comes along is that, we can put in these things that, we know and love, like schema. We can also put in things like range checks and, pattern matches that we expect to exist. So things that we can test and validate and build into our pipelines, right? And certainly, if you're transmitting data between different systems and different programming languages, I just this afternoon kind of went off on a bit of a tangent on how, by virtue of being descended from JavaScript, that JSON schema, if you don't take the time and care to be really specific with your numbers, you can have some really less than optimal experiences because of, JavaScript's, let's say, relaxed approach to data types compared to some other programming languages, right? And let's not get started on equality. But and so there's additional information that we can put into the data contract that, gives us some safeguards and some security around systems and interoperability about systems, but also importantly gives us safety and I guess a degree of comfort around interoperability for people, as in, how can I use this? Can I use this? Where can I use this? What were the conditions under which this was captured? So that's, when I think of it as being for both people and humans, humans and machines, it's again, kind of that idea of interface, as in, this tells you where you can access the data. This tells you why you can access the data, and other really important things like that.
Yeah, I agree. It should be human readable and machine readable, and being machine readable allows you to do those things that you spoke about, Ryan. We can go even further than that, and we realised this quite early on, that once you have it in a machine readable format as well, you can do all sorts of things and really build a whole data platform around it. So we can do things like change management around the schema. Is it a breaking change or is it not? Have a CI check and prevent breaking changes from making it ready to production in the first place. Really removing a whole class of instance we had. We can categorize data, whether it's personal data or not, and quite easily build tooling that anonymizes data or does data retention when we should no longer have that data. And really, since the last 5 or 6 years since we're using data contracts, we haven't found anything we couldn't express in a data contract that we could then implement at a platform level. Even simple things like doing backups on data and backup, how long backups should be kept for, make sure that's done. All people have to do in their data contract is say, I want backups for 30 days. And the tooling just takes care of it. But I don't need to know exactly how it's been backed up, where it's been backed up to. It just happens. So there's a lot of these ideas come from platform engineering, which some of our listeners may be familiar with. But really, it's very powerful. Once you have this machine readable and human readable contract, there's no limit to what you can automate through that, which really helps with data governance as well. Yeah,
and coming back to that thing around interfaces, what you described there, to me, it's sort of being able to be declarative, in your intent, rather than having to be like explicit. And when you think of the things that have endured, like let's just take, our favorite SQL, right? It is, you declare your intent. You don't tell it exactly how it should go and manipulate the bits and bytes in the hard drive. You just say, go get me this thing from this thing and do this aggregation, right? And in my mind, those are the interfaces that endure. So yeah, if you have something you can evolve that is very much around allowing people to say, this is my intent and this is the things that I care about, and then abstract the implementation details or even better yet, cater for a variety of implementation details. I mean, that's the other thing that, I think is important not to overlook, is that you can have from this one document, if you need to, cater for a variety of implementations. Perhaps you have a very sort of federated data capability around your organization, and perhaps there's a very compelling reason for Team A to write their, implement a functionality that Team B has in a very specific way. And that's okay, as long as they can agree on the interface.
What is the future or the desired end state for data contracts in general, now that we're seeing a lot of attention on them and more adoption? Andrew, I think you're probably the person who's put more thought into this than probably anyone else in the world. And I'd like to know where your thoughts are trending when it comes to what happens next in the current environment.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think data contracts adoption will continue because I think it's a very simple idea, like apply interfaces data, describe data, and then use that description to power a platform. Very simple idea, but very powerful. And I think we'll continue to do that. I like to think the standard will continue to take off and evolve as well, the data contract standard we spoke about earlier. Because what I find quite often is we have this data contract in one format, continuous, and we're constantly changing it to a different format to integrate with a different tool. So we convert it to protobuf to configure Kafka or whatever it might be, or convert it to some sort of JSON document to integrate with our data catalog. I mean, what would be great if we could just could just convert it to the standard format, and then you get a data catalog, you get a tooling that helps you with authentication and privacy and governance and all those kind of things. You just plug it into your data platform. So that'd be really cool if we can achieve that. That's kind of what we're working towards with the Open Data Contract Standard. So yeah, I think data contracts keep growing as an idea. And I think it would be driven by the idea that, what Ryan was saying, a lot of companies struggle with data quality. That's got a great cost in the organization in terms of how much data engineering time is spent there, how many instances you have. While at the same time, people want to do more of their data and achieve more of their data. So I think while those two things remain true, we're going to start applying more discipline to our data, and data contracts help us apply that discipline.
Both of you have had a lot of thought put into this recently with a variety of things that you've been writing. We mentioned at the top of this, Ryan, you're working on a book right now about data contracts. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, what you're hoping will come from that, and where people can find it when it's ready? No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. So I'm writing a book. I may yet live to regret that decision. No, it's certainly been a growth opportunity, and I will be certainly happy when it is done. But it's been a great opportunity to grow and learn. So what am I trying to do with this book? Well, what I'm looking to do is build upon the work that Andrew and others have done. And I alluded to it earlier. I feel that the conversation around data contracts started within data engineering and software development circles. And that's where it needed to start, and I think that's a valid place for it. But where I'm looking to do is broaden the conversation. As I mentioned, I am a recovering business analyst. And when I initially approached data contracts, I saw, it was an interface, it was declarative, and it reminded me of a number of things that I'd gotten a lot of value out of my career as a business analyst, things like data dictionaries, things like, Cucumber, behavior-driven development, sort of Cucumber style type requirement specifications. And I thought, yes, this is fantastic, because for all the things that we spoke about earlier, the idea that it's an interface for people and machines, it is part of a solution rather than, separate from the solution. But also I see it as a way to kind of bring in perhaps some disciplines that I feel maybe have been, I don't say missing, but it certainly feels like we had an understanding a couple of years ago around how to build a 3-tier application, across disciplines. We knew it from a database perspective, we knew it from a software engineering perspective, and we knew it from like a requirements management perspective. Like everyone had kind of had the benefit of seeing the pattern a good few times. It's like, yeah, we know what we're doing. And the world changed rapidly. We kind of, had microservices. We had this idea of like big data, which has now just become, well, is it big enough to fit on a MacBook? Yeah, okay, it's data. But there's still been some shifts around, again, that conversation about what does the data mean? Like what do we desire? What do we want from this data? And so what I'm hoping to do with this book is, yes, talk to practitioners, data engineers, software engineers, but also reach out to people from sort of that requirements management space, the business analysts and the data analysts, and then also to leadership to kind of say that, again, you may come to this seeking answers around data quality, right? But data, it's a side effect of things happening. Have we had a conversation about how those things happen in our organization? Do we agree, right? Because if we can't agree on that, then we're going to struggle to agree on just about everything else that flows from this. So that's really where I'm looking to kind of engage with my book, is to make the circle bigger. I think it's time. The data engineers and the software engineers, we've been talking about it for a while. And I think we need to kind of stretch out and bring some more people in.
For something that encompasses an entire organization's processes, we've got to involve the entire organization. So I'm really glad to see a lot more conversation going on about how we can involve different people from different disciplines into that space. Andrew, you also recently wrote a white paper about data contracts as well. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I wrote a relatively short white paper, again, really just to give an introduction to data contracts for people who haven't heard of it before, and really touch on the kind of power of it and why it's important and what problems it can solve in your organization. So I published that recently on my website. You can get to it at dc101.io. So DC for data contracts, the number's 101.io. And if you're interested in data contracts based on this conversation from what we've been talking about today, then that could be a good next step to go a little bit deeper and really understand the problems it can solve in your organization.
Hopefully, throughout this conversation, we've piqued your interest in the entire topic. So I want to thank you both so much, Ryan Collingwood and Andrew Jones, for joining me here today on the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. And we will see you next time.